searching history for buried classics. This is Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Welcome back to another episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming. I am your host, Sean Evans, otherwise known as Zion Tane.
And I'm your other host, Sid Bolton, also known as Dirk the Daring Online, and I'm also the gaming archaeologist on the OMG Hour.
Sid, we have someone very special on the show today.
We do. I'm very excited.
This is an interview that we have been waiting for, I think we knew about this almost 2 months ago.
Yes, this individual is a very busy person in the video game industry, and so we had to wait until he had a bit of a break in his schedule to be able to talk to us.
So this is a gentleman who I think most people know from his many games and companies he's been involved in, such as Naughty Dog, Insomniac Games. Of course, he helped create Sonic the Hedgehog 2 even. He's been around a long time in the gaming industry.
Yes, he has, and he's been a consultant on more games than we can even possibly list here today. We're going to be talking to him about, a couple specific ones, but just an absolute pleasure to have this gentleman with us today for an interview. Very, very excited.
And of course, we are talking about, if you have not already guessed, Mark Cerny. And we will be talking to him about some of his early games from when he joined Atari at the tender old age of 17 years old.
Yeah, got started very early.
Yeah, and he created Marble Madness, which is a game that I remember very fondly from my Commodore 64 days. And of course, it was originally developed for the arcade and ported to the home systems from there.
Yeah, and I played the Amiga version, so we both played it early on. Interesting that neither of us played it in the arcade, but that's where the inspiration and the original came from.
Yeah, and I remember I loved Marble Madness. I mean, when there's been a lot of games that have taken inspiration from Marble Madness. I can't think of the exact name of it offhand, but wasn't there an early Xbox arcade game that was similar?
Yes, there was, that used kind of a marble that went around, and I can't remember the name of it either, but I know the game you're talking about.
Yeah, and that was, when that came out on Xbox Live Arcade, I loved it because it brought me back to that Marble Madness days. Yes. I loved playing that game on my Commodore 64. And of course, we're going to be talking to Mark about his history in the gaming industry and how Marble Madness came to be, and a little bit about the new stuff that came into being with Marble Madness in the arcade, right? They had to create actually new hardware for this game in the arcade, and he'll talk about how that happened. So let's move on. We have a very special treat. It's Mark Cerny talking about Marble Madness. Mark, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on Lost Treasures of Gaming, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
So most of our listeners probably know you from the many games and companies you've worked with over the years. But we want to go way back in time to 1984 to when you came out with Marble Madness. But before we get into that, can you give us a little bit of a history of how you got into gaming in the first place? I understand you started working for Atari when you were just 17 years old.
Yes, so I was born in 1964, and when I was 12 or 13, a friend of mine said, wow, you just have to come out to the arcade. There's this game, and he described the whole game, something about enemy forces moving towards you and you hiding behind a bunker and having to kind of take shots at them around the bunker. And I got to the arcade, and it turns out he was talking about Space Invaders, of all things.
That's what it sounded like, yeah.
Well, not the image I had in my mind, but I had to agree it was pretty phenomenal. And after that, I was hooked at the arcades. I'd also been programming a bit. My brother and I had this crazy idea that we'd do a paper RPG, but we do it on computer with 3D graphics. Really hard to do back in the day. We were trying to use punch cards to write our code.
Oh, wow.
I finally saw the game we were trying to make many years later. It was called Final Fantasy VII.
Okay.
A little ambitious for two high school students in their spare time. But I started thinking, what if I took these two hobbies and tried to turn it into a job? Took the programming, took the love of the arcade games, and starting when I was 16, I went out and looked for people who might want to hire me as a programmer. And believe it or not, I managed to talk Atari Games into hiring me at the age of 17.
Wow, that's incredible. What was it like working for Atari back then?
Well, I got in the last couple of years of the golden age of the arcade. My heroes were there: Dave Toyer, Ed Logg. Those are the creators of Tempest, Centipede. Great number of the best games of the era. So the idea that I'd have an office just a couple doors down from those guys, that was amazing.
I bet. And was Marble Madness the first game you did at Atari?
It was the third game I did. So Atari was structured very strangely, looking back at it. You got in, and they sat you down, and they said, your job is to think up a game and program it, do the artwork, do the sound. We'll make hardware for you, whatever you request. And so you were pretty much 100% empowered to go wherever you felt would be interesting. But at the same time, none of us coming in the door had any experience in games. It isn't as if we were hired from some other game company. And so the crop of people who came in with me in 1982, pretty much everybody's first game was a complete failure. Mine was a sliding tile puzzle game called Quack, Qwak, that got so far as a play test in the arcades, and we just abandoned it at that point. The second game I worked on was Major Havoc. That had been going on for over a year, and it had a very senior programmer named Owen Rubin programming it and designing it. So I joined late and helped him get it out the door. And then Marble Madness was my third project, which was much more something that I drove from a creative standpoint.
So I know, Sid, you're a fan of Major Havoc. Do you want to jump in there before we get into Marble Madness?
Yeah, one of the things about Major Havoc, of course, was that it was vector-based, so it was, more like had more in common with Asteroids than say Space Invaders in terms of the graphics capabilities, although it was color. And I remember, being quite fascinated, with the animation in the game. And of course, the other thing that always stuck out in my mind, and I wanted to ask you about, was the fact that I don't know if this is the first instance of it happening. What if you just basically sat there and didn't do anything, your character would tap his feet like he was, kind of annoyed that you were taking too long to do something. And I don't know why that stuck with me, but of course when I would see that later on in many, many games, of course, including ones that you've been involved with, I've always thought back to that time playing Major Havoc in the arcade and being just quite fascinated with that. And it sounds really silly because it doesn't really have anything to do with playing the game, but that little touch that was in there in the game was something that has just stuck with me through all the times I've played games. And I think that it's one of those things, looking back now, I don't know, do you know if that was the first time something like that had ever been implemented, or was that your idea, or how did that come about?
Well, I do know that's the exact same foot tapping that Sonic the Hedgehog does.
Yes.
8 years before Sonic the Hedgehog. I don't know. The character was drawn and animated by Lyle Raines, who was the vice president that we all worked for, but he was also a very creative guy who was trying to assist with the games in various ways. So I have to imagine that he and Owen Rubin just kind of cooked that up for the title.
Okay. Yeah, it's just one of those things. Like I said, I remember being so surprised by it because I actually played Major Havoc in the arcade, and I've also found that it's just been one of those games that seems to not have gotten as much attention as other games from that time period, and I've always been sort of saddened by that. And even looking at its availability today, it's available in a couple compilations, but I mean, unless you have a MAME cabinet, which I do, and whatnot, and you can maybe run it that way or see it in some other way, it seems like it's kind of difficult to play it today, unlike a lot of other classic arcade games. So I've always been kind of sad about that it hasn't sort of made its way out to more players.
Well, I mean, the reason is it wasn't financially very successful, right? We only made 300 dedicated cabinets for that game.
Wow.
And the rest, we might have done 2,000 or 3,000 conversion boards for Tempest, but those are tiny numbers in an era where Centipede was selling its 60,000 units.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, those are huge numbers. Now, of course, you moved on then to Marble Madness after Major Havoc. Now, was this a game that was basically your creation? Was this something that was totally yours, or were you working with other people on it? How did Marble Madness come to be?
Well, I mean, pretty much every game that was made was a collaboration of some kind or another. In 1983, I went around the office and brainstormed with anybody I could find about the core concept for Marble Madness. I was hoping to do something kind of miniature golf-like for my next title. That was what I was thinking in terms of. I didn't get around to actually kicking off the programming until 1984. And in the interim, I was, among other things, waiting for the hardware to get made for the game. We were really hoping to use something quite sophisticated that would draw most of those graphics without software intervention. You just set up a height field, and the hardware would display it.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting.
And that completely did not happen. In the intervening time between I was hoping to kick off the title, and when we actually got started, the arcade business took a real downturn. Actually, I think it took its downturn even before I started the design process. The arcade business had gotten completely saturated in the States. There was something like 1.5 million arcade cabinets out there by the summer of 1982. This is in a country which I think in those days only had 200 million people. We did not need that many games, and so there was a limit to just how much money people were willing to spend playing them, and that meant that it got very, very difficult to sell anything new. And so sales went from, I don't know, Pac-Man days and Centipede days, which had been 50,000 to 100,000 units, down to something more like 10,000 for a really successful title in just the space of 2 or 3 years. And so Atari was trying to figure out how to make all these economics work, and their conclusion was that they needed to make a system where the cabinet would be purchased once and the hardware once, and then basically you'd insert giant cartridges into the hardware, kind of like the SNK system that came out many years later.
Right, yeah.
And put new decals on it and replace the control panel, and instead of an arcade machine costing $2,000-3,000, an arcade machine, well, at least to rev the software, would be just a few $100s.
See, and that's how I'm growing up. That's how I always thought arcades were, to be honest with you. I always thought that, they bought the unit, and there was always these control boards that they essentially was the game. And they could pull them out and put in another game. That's just, maybe that's how things went, but I always understood that's how things were in the arcade.
So that was definitely, there were a lot of games that were kits where you would replace the entire hardware. But the idea here was that the hardware would stay in there. Hardware, power supply, all of that would stay in there, and all you do is add in a giant cartridge. And by a giant cartridge, I mean a PCB that was probably 2 feet wide.
Wow.
And you would stick that in.
Wow. And is that what you had to use for Marble Madness?
Marble Madness was the first game for that. So that system was called System 1. It was a low-res system is what we called it. It was about 256 pixels across. Paperboy was the debut game, if I remember properly, for System 2, which was a medium-res system. It was about 512 pixels across.
Wow.
And so Marble Madness went out as that first cabinet, but then the Marble Madness machines got quickly converted to other games in the series.
And Marble Madness, as I understand it as well, was probably one of the first, at least for the Atari system, one of the first arcade games to be programmed in C rather than using assembly language. And what kind of challenges did that bring forth for you, and what benefits were there to going to C?
Well, I mean, it was a heck of a lot easier to write code. We've been writing our code in assembly. C was the first, Marble Madness was the first title at Atari to get programmed in C. There had been some experiments with other higher level languages such as Forth. I guess it was
nothing in COBOL though, right? Nothing. Please tell me there was nothing in
COBOL.
Good.
No.
Good.
It was very easy to code in C, but then again, the performance was terrible. The arcade games had been all shipping at 60 hertz, and then Marble Madness, in perhaps a sign of the future, shipped at 30 hertz. It was a real departure for Atari, but that was the best that we could do in a high-level language. We just didn't have that much CPU power.
And was part of that, do you think, too, like, obviously you were probably using pretty early C compilers and things like that maybe weren't as optimized as stuff is today as well, right? I mean, I'm sure that was part of it. And you also used some ray tracing techniques, because I remember one of the things that stood out, and I have to tell you, my experience with Marble Madness actually started not in the arcade, but for me it was in the porting to the home platforms with the Amiga, and the Amiga version.
The Commodore 64 for me.
Wow. So the Amiga version was much closer to what the arcade looked like, because the resolution was similar and the CPU was similar. The sound was probably pretty close to the same because the Amiga had such great sound capabilities and so on. But I remember just being so, amazed by, not to play a pun there, amazed by the game just because it was so, it was just so good. It was so compelling. It was compelling from, the gameplay standpoint. The graphics were amazing for the time, and the music was great as well. Like, I can still hear the music in my head even today. Just of thinking about the game, I can hear the music, and I certainly can't say that for a lot of games. I mean, I own, 15,000 video games, and I've played, not all of them, but I've played a lot of games in my time, and I can't say that I remember all of them the way that I remember Marble Madness. So whatever magic sauce you put in there has stuck with me, and obviously many other gamers throughout the years. So obviously you had those challenges, but you did some amazing stuff there for me to remember it so long after the fact.
Well, I mean, the reason that the frame rate was not so great, I do agree the compiler technology was pretty primitive in those days, but also the CPU ran at 7 megahertz.
Right.
So that was pretty good for the day, but I mean, quickly that went up to 100 megahertz by the end of the decade.
Now, Sid, you brought something up about the sound in this game, and I'm just reading here that this was the first game to use an FM sound chip by Yamaha. Was there anything? Did that create any challenges in creating this game, that you had to use this new sound chip?
Oh, I'm sure it created some challenges, but from my perspective, it was very easy. As the two musicians on the project, who were Brad Fuller and Hal Cannon, went off for a couple months, figured out what the chip could or couldn't do, composed that music, came back and said, "What do you think? Do you like it?" And I said, "Great." And that was my contribution to the music of the game.
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
Excellent.
Perfect.
So now, were you involved, Mark, with any of the ports to the home consoles at the time?
Yeah, I got briefly fascinated by the first, what was the black and white Apple computer, 1985?
Come on, Sid, you should know this.
Just the straight Macintosh?
Just the straight Macintosh, and the idea that you could somehow use dithering of white and black pixels to get similar effects in there, even if you didn't have any colors to play with. But nothing came of that.
Well, it's amazing what dithering can do, because even a game like Dragon's Lair, which of course was, had the amazing full color animation on the video discs, actually was converted to the black and white Macintosh with dithering. And although it is horrible in certain ways, it's actually kind of amazing what black and white dithering can do and how it can trick your eye into seeing multiple shades of gray. But yeah, I can't see a very colorful, very artistic game like Marble Madness translating very well, no matter how much dithering you did. Plus, there was a lot of shadows in the game. And the other thing, do you know if this was the first video game to use anti-aliasing or ray tracing or both? Because you use both of those things in the game to deliver the graphics. I'm just not sure if that was the first game to do so or not.
I suspect it was not the first game to do it, but I don't know of a counterexample. I mean, in the 1970s, there were any number of technologically advanced games. Remember Tail Gunner? I mean, people were doing games with full 3D in the mid-70s.
Right. But it was just so good. I mean, what you delivered was so good. And so, just reading some of my own research, I see that you were inspired by M.C. Escher, of course, who always creates those interesting visual images. How important was that to you and what you were coming up with in the final product? Was it something that just did it determine how some of the game would play, or was it just something that you wanted to achieve throughout as you developed?
Oh, I put in one Escher-esque optical illusion in one of the levels, and that was about it. I mean, for me, the game, I mean, it was, originally I was just looking at miniature golf and thinking, gosh, how do we get that dimensionality in a game? But it was very hard to solve the puzzle of what the gameplay would be. I experimented with some things that were actually like miniature golf, where you'd hit the ball and nobody thought they were interesting. And then I realized you could steer the ball directly using a trackball, and that seemed to work. But then the next sort of detour the project took is I thought it would be a race. I thought you'd be racing through one of these worlds against a AI opponent or another human player, and that turned out to be no fun at all.
Now, did you ever play Zany Golf that Electronic Arts released probably 5 years after you did Marble Madness, which was miniature golf and kind of with a bunch of strange things? But now that I think about it, I mean, Electronic Arts handled most of, if not all of, the home ports of Marble Madness. Do you think there was any correlation there? Do you have any idea if there was or not?
I don't know. I mean, that had an isometric look to it, but the isometric look had gotten quite popular by the end of the 80s. Isometric look, I think, at Atari was pioneered by Franz Lanzinger in Crystal Castles. He used to joke about how I wouldn't get credit for it because he'd already done it 1 year earlier.
Right. How important was it to be first with doing certain techniques? Was that ever on your mind as you were doing a lot of this stuff, or was it more just about just making the best game you could possibly make?
Well, in the arcade, you needed to catch people's eyes, so definitely having something that you were doing that was unusual visually was a big help. So, I mean, most games had their fairly idiosyncratic presentation of the game, I guess.
Now, you mentioned earlier about some numbers of how the numbers were declining in the arcade. Now, how well did Marble Madness do once it was released?
We got 3,000 or 4,000 machines out there when all was said and done. Not a great number, but enough that as a collector you can definitely get one of them today.
Yeah,
right.
And that's important nowadays.
And do you have any of, you've worked on so many games. I mean, I would hate to ask you what your favorite is of all the ones you've worked on, because I'm sure that's an impossible question for you because they're probably all your children. But do you have any of these, older, arcade machines you worked on, or any of the older stuff that you have worked on over the years? Do you have that in your own personal collection or no?
Well, there were 6 prototypes that were made, and on the team, we each got one. My prototype has been out on loan to a friend for the past 15 years. That tells you how much I play it.
And how do we become closer friends, Mark? I guess that's an offline
I think
conversation.
if you have 15,000 games in your collection, that I'm the one going over to your place.
Yeah, seriously.
Games. That's what I think.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. And I have
15,000 games. So if you play one a day, all it takes is what, 30 years? Am I doing the math properly to get through those?
Yeah, I actually at one point in time I figured out if I played a different game in the morning and a different game in the afternoon, I would have to retire in about 2 years. And if I lived to like 85 or something like that, I could play, couple games a day, that would sustain me through to retirement and to my eventual, death if I lived to an average of 85 or something like that. But yeah, I did once figure that out. I can't, the numbers always change, right?
But you'd never finish a game.
No, just be able to try it, right?
That's right.
And the problem is that when I play games, I tend to finish them. I like to, which is really unfortunate in one sense. I mean, I do, when I review things, I have to, of course, try them for just a certain amount of time. But the rest of the time, I'm so focused on finishing games. Now, having said that, just to ask you sort of a general question, like you have become such a consultant in the gaming industry, and you obviously, you just have something about you that essentially makes you know how to make games fun and what makes a good game and what makes a bad game, essentially. And I can say that with confidence because you've obviously worked on so many successful games. Do you have any idea why you've been so successful in that? And do you still feel the same way about video games that you did when you got started?
Well, I mean, there have been a lot of successful titles. I've been lucky enough to work with some amazing companies like Naughty Dog, back in the day when it was, 3 people when I met them and about 100 by the time I stopped working with them. Or Insomniac, there's another amazing company to have worked with. And as for how I feel, I'm still dreaming the dream. I'm still hoping that next game is the one that ends up in the history books for something or other. But
you have lots of that already. Lots of your games are in the history book for something or other.
Well, I mean, sure. But you look at it, and to be very honest about the titles that I've worked on, none of them have even been nominated for Game of the Year. I mean, if we think about it, the number of times that I have been on stage receiving an award for a game, that would be 0. And so the hope is still that there will be this thing that I make that is of some stunning creativity and beauty, and everybody responds. And I do end up on the stage at some point saying thank you very nicely to my collaborators.
Right. Well, I think you may not feel that way, and in one sense that's good because that'll keep you working on new titles and whatnot. But I think that you have accomplished much more than maybe you're giving yourself credit for here. And I certainly, as I said, I've followed you in the games that you've worked on, and you've worked on some of my absolute favorite games. So if I was to give a collaborator an award, and I think right now, Sean, we should have an OMG Nexus / Lost Treasures of Gaming award for, some of my favorite games of all time. And I would certainly give that award to you in a heartbeat because there's so many games that you've been involved with. And, we're talking a lot about Marble Madness, and that alone is something that just, I still, every once in a while, we actually have it set up at the Personal Computer Museum, and we have several Amigas out there. And we don't play the arcade version usually, but we do play the Amiga version quite a bit. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people walk in that will say, I remember this game, I love this game. So, you've had more impact, I think, on people than you realize.
Thank you for the kind words.
No problem.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for being on Lost Treasures of Gaming. It has been a pleasure speaking to you. I mean, is there anything you can talk about what you're working on now? Can you say where you are now and what you're doing?
Not so much at this point.
Okay, that's fair. What about following you? Can people follow you on Twitter or Facebook or anything like that?
I'm not actually on Twitter yet.
No, you're not a social media guy?
Well, I'm thinking it might be good at some point. What do you think? Take a punch.
Probably.
Sure.
Probably.
Well, I mean, if you probably do work on a lot of things that you can't talk about too, so that probably makes it a little bit more difficult. But we can, we could find out maybe what your favorite meal choices are and what you had for lunch yesterday and all that kind of stuff, because that's all important, because there's influences out there everywhere. So, if you see something you like, you just take a picture of it or something like that. There are useful things for Twitter.
Sure. Everybody loves the food pics, right?
You could tell us, what did you have for lunch today?
Great.
That would be a perfect example.
Mark, thank you so much for being on Lost Treasures of Gaming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mark. It was so nice to meet you. And again, thank you for all the games you've worked on, and I'm looking forward to whatever it is you're working on right now.
Thank you.
So, Sid, you're a little bit of a fanboy there today.
Yeah, I know. I kind of felt bad. I was gushing a little bit through the microphone there. Sorry about that. I couldn't help it. And by the way, Sean, at the beginning of the show, you were talking about games that inspired. I think you were that were inspired by Marble Madness later on. I think you were thinking about Marble Blast Ultra.
That's the one.
Yeah, that was the one. So I just wanted to mention that before I forgot.
Yes.
But yes, wow, Mark, incredible person. He's been involved in so much. Obviously we kept our conversation sort of limited to his early years, but he did mention Naughty Dog and Insomniac, and of course he was instrumental in the architectural design of the PlayStation 4. We didn't talk about that.
Absolutely.
But funny him talking about being on the stage, and although he maybe hasn't been on the stage for an award in the sense that maybe he's looking for in that validation, but he's been on this stage with Sony at their press conferences, and certainly has been on the stage in many cases. But he tends to be someone who's in the background, really working on making games fun, and he's certainly, the games that he has worked on have been ultimately a lot of fun. Maybe not Game of the Year material like we were talking about, but for me, certainly some of my favorite games of all time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he seems to have that sort of that Midas touch on a game.
It's almost the sixth sense to know what makes a game really great, and he certainly, he says he has the fortune to have worked on those games, but I think obviously he's added a lot to those games to bring them to be the great games that they are.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, dear listeners, I hope you enjoyed that as much as we did. Thank you for listening to another awesome episode of Lost Treasures of Gaming. Don't forget every Friday to visit GamingHistory101.com for an awesome video done by our friend there, Fred, and he does a video for the game that we talk about. Of course, you can follow us on Twitter at Lost Treasures OG, and I can be found pretty much everywhere online as Zientane.
You can find me on Twitter as Sid Bolton, so that's at Sid Bolton. That's Sid with a Y, don't forget, just like Sydney, Australia. And if you have an idea for a show, maybe someone that we should interview, maybe an incredible guest, someone like Mark Cerny, or just somebody that's made something that's just a great game that maybe a lot of people don't know about, please send us an email to losttreasuresofgaming@gmail.com. And if you want to read our show notes and maybe find out about our mothership show, the OMG Hour, you can just go to omgnexus.com. There's also some great video game reviews there that you should check out.
And I can tell you all right now that we have another big treat for you next week.
Yes.
I'm just saying.
It's definitely been a great year for our first year of this podcast. We've had some amazing people on the show.
Yes, and to send the year out, we've got another amazing name for you next week. So be sure to tune in again to the next Lost Treasures of Gaming. We'll talk to you next week.
See you soon.
This has been an OMGNexus.com production.